Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. Assalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Assalamualaikum. Guys, we are back here to continue to examine the nature of the profit rate risk in Islamic banking. So this is part 2, where we will be looking at the concept of income gap and one of the way to measure the profit rate risk. And that will be the earning at risk, which bank uses today to illustrate to what extent banks are impacted from changes in the level of interest rate. So earlier, we have shown you that from the data given, that the income gap is the difference between the VRA and VRL. So this is the formulation for the income gap. Why is it that it is only focusing on the variable rate asset and liability? This is because we want to see from any change in interest rate, of course, what we expect to see is how it will be affecting the asset and liability. So that must be related to those assets that are rate sensitive, as well as deposit that are rate sensitive. So that is why those rate sensitive assets, they are categorized as VRA, variable rate asset, meaning that the profit rate or the interest rate can be accommodated or can be changed accordingly to the changes in the interest rate. And likewise, VRL, we are referring to deposit or liability, where the deposit rate can be changed up and down based on the movement of interest rate. So the income gap, the formula would be VRA minus VRL. So given from the data that our VRA is 100 billion and the VRL is 400 billion, so the income gap is a negative $300 billion. So it means that the bank has a negative income gap of 300 billion. So what does it imply? Because we can see that in the income gap of minus 300 billion, the VRA is lower than the VRL, right? So the VRL exceeded the VRA, implying that any increase in interest rate will likely to increase the bank interest expense more than the interest rate income the bank receives. So meaning that the interest rate expense will increase more than the interest rate revenue. For Islamic bank, the cost of deposit will increase more than the profit revenue. So that is essentially what the income gap is trying to imply, a negative income gap of 300, meaning that the change in the increase in interest expense or the increase in cost of deposit is more than the increase in interest revenue or interest or profit revenue. And that is not what the bank would like to see, because the bank like to see the opposite, that the increase in interest income should be more than the increase interest in the interest expense, so that the bank earning will be positive. But in the case where the income gap is negative 300, what we see is something that is not welcoming to the bank. So the impact of 1% increase change can be calculated by the income gap. So that is why we call it the income gap theory, right? So a 1% increase in the interest rate, how that will be impacting bank profit or banking earning. So we'll be using this formulation, that is impact on bank earning is equal to the income gap multiplied by the interest rate change. So for Islamic bank, since the profit rate is set based on the benchmark interest rate, which is the OPR, So an increase in the OPR will increase the profit rate, because as we see the formulation, the loan rate is equal to the OPR plus the spread. The profit rate is also equal to the OPR plus the spread. So when interest rate goes up by 1%, the OPR will go up by 1%, and it will affect both Islamic bank and conventional bank, because Islamic bank uses the benchmark rate, that is the OPR, to price their product. And when we see here, the impact on earning will be minus 300 billion multiplied by the 1%. So the minus income gap of 300 billion multiplied by 1% increase in interest rate will give a negative 3 billion. So when the income gap is negative 300 billion, 1% increase in interest rate will reduce bank earning by 3 billion. So this is something that is not desirable for banks, because this is a contraction in earning caused by the negative income gap. So bank would like to see the opposite, that is an increase in interest rate. It should be able to somehow sustain the earning by way of allowing the deposit rate to increase in equivalent amount to the increase in the interest revenue. But what we see here is that the increase in the interest expense is much more than the increase in interest revenue, because of the fact that the VRA is lower than the VRL. So just to repeat the interpretation of the result, that based on the negative income gap of minus 300 billion, 1% increase in interest rate will result in a fall in bank earning of 3 billion. So this is a no-no for banking, and so that is why bank must be able to ensure that not only that they are making good loans, prudent loans in order to prevent default, but at the same time they must make sure that the loan is able to respond to any changes in the level of interest rate if there is such volatility. So this negative impact occur because the bank has more VRL than VRA. The bank has more rate sensitive deposit than rate sensitive loan or murabaha. And as we see that as interest rate goes up, the bank cost of borrowing, which is the cost of deposit, would increase, but it does not gain as much additional income from the asset, because the asset, most of the asset are categorized as FRA. So indeed there is some increase in revenue, but the increase in the cost of deposit is much more higher than the increase in interest revenue or profit revenue, and for that reason we see that the final result is a decline in earning by minus 3 billion, and this is something that need to be done, to be readily observed by banks, so that they are able to strategize to ensure that the income gap is not as large as what we see here in our example. Maybe to have a balance of VRL equal to the variable rate asset equal to VRA. But again, that depends on the risk appetite of the bank, to what extent they want to offer loan or murabaha with fixed rate or with variable rate, because changing in the level of interest rate imply that interest rate may increase or it may decrease, So in the case of a reduction in interest rate, then we will see here, for example, in our result here, 1% reduction in interest rate, we can see that if the interest rate here, 0.01% is a negative amount, then we can see that a negative value of 1%, meaning that interest rate goes down by 1%, and multiplied by a negative 300 billion, then we have a plus 3 billion. So when interest rate goes down, then a bank that is facing a negative gap will experience a higher profit. So this is another area that we would like to see later on with regards to the impact on banking earning when interest rate is falling. Okay guys, I think we can just stop here, and then inshallah I'll see you again. Thank you for your time. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.